Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event. My name is Dr. Sean Brennan. I'm from the History Department. This is, of course, a collaborative event between the History Department and the University of Scranton Schemmel Forum. So glad we got such a sizable crowd, and I'm sure an enthusiastic crowd tonight for our guest speaker, Martin Nekola. So I'll just briefly talk about the parameters of the event, I suppose. Martin is going to speak for around 45 minutes, and then we will have about 15, 20, 25 minutes for a Q&A. I'll just bring the microphone to whoever wants to ask a question. Make sure you ask a question. Don't try and give a little speech yourself. And then after that, we will have a brief reception here. Without further ado, I want to introduce Sundar Meyers, without whom none of these Schemmel Forum events would be possible, and she will be here to introduce Martin. Thank you.
It is a great pleasure for the Schemmel Forum to collaborate with the History Department in bringing to our campus an outstanding world affairs speaker. Each time we have the opportunity to hear a scholar or a journalist from abroad, I believe we make this institution a better place. I think the idea that we should be living in a post-provincial world, even though my idea is far from a reality, I will persist in working toward that goal. I am especially pleased to welcome a Czech scholar from Charles University, as I have had the opportunity to get to know Prague and the institution and other Czech scholars when I did some consulting work for the Radio Free Europe back in the late 90s. Martin Nekola will speak to us today on Czechoslovak exile to the US, and that's slightly changed. Well, we are in one of those eras in America where immigration is under scrutiny and discouraged. I'm sure that those in the room can appreciate the importance of immigration to our well-being as a nation. Pluralism is one of our most treasured legacies, and our immigrants, and in particular many of those from Central and Eastern Europe, have enriched the intellectual and cultural climate of our nation exponentially. So we are deeply grateful to Dr. Nekola for taking the time to come to the University of Scranton to give us an idea of what Czechoslovak exile after World War II meant to the exiles and what it means to us Americans. Please welcome him to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. The lecture was originally scheduled as the lecture about the Czechoslovak exile, and with your permission, I would rather enhance it to the talk about the Eastern European exile in general. I'm a political scientist and historian born in Prague. My main area of research is the Cold War migration from Central and Eastern Europe, from behind the Iron Curtain to Western countries, above all to the United States, but also to Canada, Latin American countries, and Australia. The anti-communist exile during the Cold War and the fate of Czechs abroad who sought the return of freedom and democracy to their homeland are an integral part of our modern history. However, this phenomenon is still neglected, and the general public has only fragmentary information about it. For me, the exile studies are a great opportunity and an almost unexplored field because they combine a wide range of disciplines: history, sociology, psychology, international relations, literature. I think that each of us may research and analyze the exile from individual perspectives and aspects. Again, since I'm a political scientist and historian, I focus primarily on the exile politics and everything related to this topic. Political agendas, political organizations and parties active in the exile, propaganda, relations with other exile communities, etc., etc. However, what does the exile politics really mean? What are its manifestations? Who are its representatives? I believe the scope of exile politics in the early Cold War is not clearly defined, and that is something I'm trying to do research on. I'm not sure how you define the terms in English, but the term emigration in Czech generally means the voluntary departure from a homeland for economic reasons, while exile is the departure for political, religious, ideological, moral, and other non-economic reasons. Of course, in reality, it is often difficult to separate these two categories. For example, the modern history of my nation dealt with the migration fairly often. Many Czechs left beginning in the second half of the 19th century to find better living conditions in Western Europe and in the United States, for example. Political emigration or an exile resistance to an oppressive regime played a significant role during both world wars and after the communist coup in 1948 and later after the occupation of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. Let me make a brief historical overview at first. On February 25th, 1948, Czechoslovak President Edvard Beneš accepted the resignation of 12 democratic ministers from 3 democratic parties. Let me remind you that the coalition government at that time had 26 members, and since only a minority resigned, the communist prime minister Klement Gottwald had a free hand to fill out his government with members of the same parties, which kept the formal distribution of power, but he chose people who were hidden Trojan horses completely obedient to the communists. So from this moment on, the floodgates of communist oppression opened, and the first politicians, journalists, academics, criticizing the methods of the Reds, did not hesitate to flee Czechoslovakia before they could be imprisoned. In the search for the accurate data on this post-February exile, we encounter widely varying statistics. Researchers are still unable to agree on the magnitude of individual waves of emigration between 1948 and 1989, until the fall of the Iron Curtain. Some authors work with a very rough number, and I would say an overestimate number of 500,000 of Czechs and Slovaks who left. I think that half of this number, so 250,000, is a more realistic figure. The estimate of the Czechoslovak state security at the end of 1948 states about 8,600 refugees, and for the period between 1948 and 1953, so the first 5 years of communist regime, state security lists a total number of 43,000 people. But in reality, we are talking about 60,000, I would say. The first steps in a free world brought these people into the so-called displaced person camps in Western occupation zones of Germany and Austria and in Italy. These facilities were under the administration of the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, one of the United Nations agencies based in Switzerland. Between 1947 and 1952, the whole, let's say, refugee agenda in Western Europe was under the control of the IRO. In July 1948, the organization granted the status of political refugees also for the Czechoslovak refugees with the same legal protection and, let's say, benefits and as the other prior residents of the camps. Like the Baltic people, Ukrainians, Cossacks, Bulgarians, Poles, etc., etc. It is half-forgotten fact that more than 20 million people in Europe were out of their home countries by the end of the World War II. These included, former forced laborers returning from Germany, expelled German minorities from Central and Eastern Europe, and above all, people escaping from Stalin and from communist regimes or refusing repatriation back behind the Iron Curtain. Therefore, the IRO and other humanitarian organizations and refugee funds faced an enormous task. The displaced person camps were meant to host only one nationality. There were, for example, separate Latvian, Polish or Ukrainian camps, but in most cases, several nationalities were living together. The Czechs and Slovaks, as you can see, ended up in various locations in Germany or in Austria. Accommodation for refugees met only very basic requirements, wooden shacks, former prisoner of war camps, military barracks, schools, factories, or even more primitive housings such as tents, train cars, and other various provisional types of housing. The newly arrived refugees were carefully interviewed and given some degree of protection, or they were declared ineligible for protection by the IRO. The atmosphere in the camps was extremely tense because there was a widespread belief that the Cold War would quickly change into an armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. But as time passed and people remained long months or even years in the camps, sending visa applications and waiting for working permits and transports to a new home countries. We also need to understand that Western Europe still lay in ruins. The economy was painfully slow in recovering from the war. The production in factories stalled and unemployment was very high. French politics, for example, was convulsed by permanent constitutional crisis. And suddenly the same countries were to be hit by a massive influx of immigrants. Logically, the countries were not prepared for that, and the population did not hide their fears and indignation. So refugees looked beyond the boundaries of Europe. The, let's say, dream destination was the United States of America, of course, but American immigrant quotas were very strict, so more and more people were going to Latin America, to Australia, to New Zealand, which were looking for flesh, blood, and experts in a wide range of disciplines. Medical doctors, engineers, craftsmen had opened door to South Africa, for example, while workers in factories and timber plants were cordially invited to Canada. In my opinion, the life in these facilities, in these displaced person camps, deserve much further research. I would liken it to a unique microcosm, where you could have found black market, prostitution, violent and boozy clashes, as well as churches, chapels, libraries, schools, kindergartens, sport associations, scout troops, etc., etc. To make the story short, I think that the life of Czechs and Slovaks in the refugee camps is very interesting, and I'm currently gathering materials to write a book on this topic. In these camps, also the first magazines, brochures, and leaflets were published, and the first seeds of political activity were born. Now, while doing my research on the Czechoslovak exile and its developments, I began to think in a broader way about the Cold War emigres from all countries behind the Iron Curtain. And I began to question how the Czechoslovak experience was unique and specific in comparison to the Polish, Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Baltic emigres. As you know, political emigration has played a prominent role in the modern history of all the countries in the region, as well as in the Eastern European ethnic presence in the United States, because between 1890 and the World War I, the number of incomers from this region increased, and it accounted for about 70% of total American immigration. And in 1920s and 1930s, there were about 2 million first and second generation Poles in this country, in America, almost 1 million of Czechs and Slovaks, 300,000 Hungarians, 260,000 Yugoslavs, and 150,000 Romanians. After the Yalta Conference in 1945, a large number of political emigres who had already experienced communist rule were convinced that the Yalta agreements were not conducive to an independent and democratic existence for the Eastern European countries. They decided to remain in the West and didn't return to their homelands after the liberation from the Nazis and watched the irreversible Sovietization from afar. Communists, backed by Moscow, took power in Albania, Romania, and Bulgaria in 1945. Hungary and Poland followed soon after. And Czechoslovakia fell as the very last limited pluralist democracy in February 1948. So former democratic, as I mentioned, politicians, diplomats, high government and military officials, as well as journalists and academics did not hesitate for long to leave and to start another struggle for freedom and democracy in exile. At first they settled in Paris and London, but soon after the, let's say, headquarters of the exile activities moved overseas to New York or Washington. In the United States, in December 1947, the newly formed National Security Council warned that the Soviet Union was conducting an intensive propaganda campaign directed primarily against the United States, employing coordinated psychological, political, and economic measures designed to undermine non-communist elements in Europe and elsewhere. The only response available to weaken and to roll back this communist influence was to initiate a psychological offensive in return. The Director of Policy Planning Staff at the State Department, George F. Kennan, presented the document called The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare on May 4th, 1948, in the presence of President Harry Truman. Kennan highlighted the importance of providing assistance for liberation committees, underground activities behind the Iron Curtain, and the support of the anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world. Kennan, together with the CIA, and drawing on advice and support from various former diplomats, businessmen, and former figures, outlined a form of anti-communist struggle that would proceed without official support, distancing the U.S. government and maintaining diplomatic relations with the East. Political and financial aid to exile leaders could then be presented as a public cause and not simply as an extension of U.S. foreign policy. So these were the beginnings of the so-called National Committee for Free Europe. The founders of this organization were initially not totally certain about or of its exact purpose and functions. They knew that this committee would not provide humanitarian aid to refugees or to help with applications for visas for those still interned in the refugee camps. Instead, it would focus on a chosen group of non-fascist and non-communist political leaders who had successfully made it to the United States to find appropriate employment and make use of their knowledge and abilities during their stay in the United States. The organization was officially founded on the May 17, 1949, and at its first press conference, a 4-point program was introduced. Through the founding of the National Committee for Free Europe, the political, organizational, and operational groundwork for all forms of anti-Soviet and anti-communist propaganda was in place. Financial aid for the committee was also assured. Donations officially came from private persons and large corporations such as Chevrolet, Ford Motor Company, General Electric, Chase National Bank, but above all, it was the behind-the-scenes support from the CIA. If you look at the chart or program of the National Committee for Free Europe, it becomes obviously that a lot of money went to exile organizations to finance their activities. And we can say that there were 3 types of political organizations involved in the anti-communist campaigns. It was the political parties in exile, national committees, and internationals. Here, for example, is the list of all the socialist parties in exile, and you see it's many of them, and it's just one of many groups in the political spectrum which became active in the exile. Because the representatives of political parties either dissolved or morphed into harmless satellites of communist parties, tried to pick up their activities in exile and to rebuild broken structures. They were working in modest surroundings with a very limited funds and a lack of human apparatus. So the inner organization, daily operations, publishing of official party materials, ways of communication with their member base, all had to be radically adapted. But as mentioned, despite numerous problems, almost all of the exiled East European party units had begun to establish themselves in the early days in the refugee camps. So party meetings were organized, basic information sheets and brochures were printed and circulated, and party structures were slowly redeveloped. The party headquarters shifted constantly according to the place of residence of their leaders, or there were several centers of power at the same time, sometimes accepting the authority of the party executive committee, or sometimes formed an inner opposition group pursuing its own independent policy. So the life of these exile subjects was often turbulent and exhausted by internal strife, expulsion of dissidents, and criticism of the leadership. However, these parties retained a key role in the exile community, and the first initiatives towards amalgamation and supranational cooperation came from them, from the parties. Many of the political parties which had existed in the interwar period, or which had operated briefly after the World War II, before the communist regimes took power and altered party system in their favor, made themselves known in some exile form. The integration on the basis of a national umbrella organization was perceived as a further necessary condition for the launch of the exile political activities. Virtually every national group of émigrés found its committee or council, accumulating various personalities and democratic political groups, from liberals to social democrats, and in which many similar characteristics are to be found. Typically, the management of these committees or councils comprised of a board of 15 to 20 members, recruited from among former statesmen, party and government officials, senior civil servants, etc., etc. A high percentage of these people were also diplomats representing their homelands in missions abroad before the communist takeovers. Each committee had its own offices with a paid staff in New York or Washington, and the number of staff varied widely, depending mainly on the financial support from the US government. The activities of these committees or councils consisted of lobbying American officials and compatriot associations in the interests of Eastern European émigrés, participating in cultural, educational, and memorial events, and maintaining an intensive information campaign in the media. And to be sure, the most important information or propaganda channel, which developed from the cooperation between the US authorities and the émigré community, was the Radio Free Europe. The importance of its called-for broadcasting was gradually increased, and its services provided a source of scarce objective information about what was happening on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It also served as a, let's say, think tank where émigrés had the opportunity to share their ideas and analysis. It served as a center of exile culture and as a, let's say, social environment in general. There were 5 national desks: the Bulgarian, Czechoslovak, Hungarian, Polish, and Romanian, whose decades-long broadcasting ranked among the phenomena of modern journalism. On the other hand, these exile committees, or these exile committee woes, included a constant lack of finances, internal crisis, and conflicts, often rooted in petty quarrels, in personal animosities, arguments about the legitimacy of leading bodies, and the absence of charismatic leaderships. In fact, none of these committees found itself in an ideal situation in the long run. Committee names, official press organs, and personal composition changed during the long years in exile. Generally, the Hungarians were able to achieve perhaps the greatest measure of solidarity in their Hungarian National Council, located in Washington and headed by Monsignor Bela Varga. Unlike similar exile organizations, the council successfully included politicians from right and left, as well as from different periods of Hungarian political history, including former collaborators with the Nazis and ultra-conservatives from the early years of Hungarian Republic, or from the late period of the Habsburg Empire. On the opposite end, the Polish émigrés were split into 3 fractions. The Romanian National Committee labored under the handicap that the majority of the Romanian emigres were far right and had considerable sympathy for the Iron Guard, the extremist organization responsible for the Holocaust in Romania in wartime. The leadership of the council, however, was rather conservative, faithful to King Michael I. The Romanians had a big advantage because they succeeded in taking a part of the Romanian golden treasury with them to the exile. So compared to other exile groups, they had adequate funds to launch their campaigns and their activities. The Bulgarian National Council in Washington was a very well-organized and active group, but it was composed largely of personal followers of its chairman, the peasant leader Georgi Dimitrov. Not the communist Dimitrov, there was another, Georgi Gemeto Dimitrov. And on February 25th, 1949, exactly 1 year after the communist coup in Czechoslovakia, also the Council of Free Czechoslovakia was established in Washington, D.C. Former mayor of Prague, Peter Zenkel, became its chairman. And again, after a very promising start and a strong support from the Department of State, the activities of the council quickly shrank. The council had a naive expectation that it would receive the recognition comparable to that which the government in exile had had during the war. Some tensions still hang in the air, the result of the defeat in February 48, the frustration, fear, and unfortunately also settling of old scores between political rivals. The fact is that the council suffered from fragmentation and conflicts which were fatally reflected in its activities. Throughout the 50s and 60s, the council was in a permanent crisis, fell apart and reunited again. The members wasted time with endless quarrels, which led to the loss of confidence of the exile public and their American donors and supporters. In the glasshouse environment, I would say, of exile, where leaders of political parties lost feedback from their voters, they were lacking a clear vision, terms and working apparatus. It was the backstage negotiations, unfulfilled ambitions, personal animosities, old friendships and old injustice that formed the basic pillars of the exile politics, unfortunately. A disagreement between two individuals was automatically considered a conflict between two groups or two ideological streams, and all of it had devastating consequences in terms of disruption and long periods of inactivity. And of course, this happened often to other exile communities as well. The National Committee for Free Europe began to provide monthly financial support to each committee for the costs of administration, travel expenses, information and social services. It was a generous but also a strict patron, and the money also became an effective instrument of pressure. If in subsequent years any of the committees did not respect the committee's recommendations and demands, the Americans first appealed for and then strongly urged before they ultimately cut back on their subsidies if it became clear that the desired results would not be forthcoming. And here we reached the main point, and it showed up quickly. The exile committees were not very effective in their activities in a long term. They were, they were damaged by internal problems and quarrels, and many of the politicians still did not understand that they were no longer in power and continued to act as if they were prime ministers or chairmen of political parties and demanded total loyalty and obedience. So they always had a camp of their supporters and also a camp of opponents. So the permanent crises of these committees were nothing unusual. American sponsors were logically dissatisfied with these conditions, and they decided to elevate the anti-communist campaign for a high level represented by international or supranational organizations, where the Albanians, Bulgarians, Czechs, etc., could cooperate together under one roof and could act more effectively, and of course could be also easily or more easily controlled. So in subsequent years, many common projects unifying the exiles came to life under the supervision of the National Committee for Free Europe. For example, there was the information campaign Crusade for Freedom, warning the American public about the communist menace. There was the Free Europe College, providing university education to talented students among the emigres. The publication of the monthly journal News from Behind the Iron Curtain. Then the broadcasting of the Radio Free Europe, of course. All of this was devised and funded by the National Committee for Free Europe, and in all of these, the exile leaders participated as editors, lecturers, analysts. The efforts of the National Committee to unite more closely the Eastern European exiles and to give the appearance that they spoke with one voice in line with US foreign policy continued and strengthened. On February 11th, 1951, 202 exile representatives signed the so-called Declaration of the Aims and Principles of Liberation of the Central and Eastern European Peoples in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It was a symbolic act, but the American media and public were very attentive to it. There were fears that World War II and the years preceding had exposed many reasons for distrust and bitterness. Nevertheless, the complicated relations between the Poles and the Czechs, Hungarians and the Romanians did not prevent a common front against the communist enemy. Soon after the Philadelphia Declaration in 1951, their cooperation was institutionalized. The so-called United National Committees and Councils in Exile organization was established to work as a think tank and discussion board, outlining possible European developments after the fall of the Soviet rule. The trend was to set out the grounds for a peaceful transition to a post-communist future, ideally involving a gradual process towards the federalization of the whole European continent. And the third type of organizations I wanted to mention were the internationals, because the visions of agrarians, Christian Democrats, liberals, or socialists about the ideal organization of society, the development of individual countries, and the entire European continent were right, logically enough. Several central themes, such as the overthrow of communist regimes and the subsequent peaceful economic and political integration, remained constant across party lines. However, specific steps to achieve their political integration remained constant across party lines. Specific steps depended on the ideological beliefs or specific émigré politicians. So, as described earlier, the nascent political parties in exile faced serious difficulties and had no choice but to look for allies among like-minded counterparts. So that was the impulse towards the creation of various internationals based on common ideological or professional background. To be specific, the exiled Christian Democrats founded the so-called Christian Democratic Union of Central and Eastern Europe. Altogether, 18 agrarian, smallholder or peasant parties resumed their work in exile and agreed to found the so-called International Peasant Union, or the Green International. Socialists and Social Democrats had the Socialist Union of Central and Eastern Europe. Liberals, the Liberal Democratic Union. Union workers were under the umbrella of the International Center of Free Trade Unions in exile, and the list can be easily expanded. Please note that it was not only the professional politicians who felt the need to be organized on a supranational level. A number of, let's say, professional and guild internationals were founded for writers, journalists, former political prisoners, professors and lecturers, students, etc., etc. And these coordination efforts also resulted in the Assembly of Captive European Nations in New York, which officially saw the light of day on September 20th, 1954, as a non-incorporated, non-profit company. This assembly was intended to act as a, let's say, shadow counterbalance to the United Nations. It was meant to coordinate the management of anti-communist campaigns, to publicize news from behind the Iron Curtain, and to generate international support for the liberation of Soviet-ruled parts of Europe. The structure of ASEN, of the Assembly, generally followed the structure of the United Nations. It consisted of a General Assembly, a General Committee, and several working committees. The sessions were held once a year, usually in September, and these functioned as the sanctioning assemblies through which various resolutions were announced and the members of the General Committee were elected. Each of the participating 9 captive nations, through their respective national committees, sent 16-member delegations to these sessions, where lectures and situational reports on developments in individual countries were presented, and voting on resolutions and protests took place. The assemblies which took place in New York at the same time as the United Nations General Assembly sessions were frequently also coordinated with public demonstrations, to raise their profile and increase the volume of their message. During 1956 and 1963, the Assembly rented a 2-story building owned by the Carnegie Endowment on the First Avenue in New York, directly opposite the United Nations headquarters. We can see the picture. So the United Nations delegates from communist countries simply could not avoid the unpleasant view of posters and billboards hanging just across the street that alerted passers-by to the ongoing Red Terror and Soviet imperialism. The democratic and liberal politicians had made the United States the focus of their liberation efforts. The organizations I mentioned did not aspire to determine the future political and economic structure for their countries, but aimed to bring about a situation wherein their people would be able to decide without foreign interference the form of government they wanted to live under. Naturally, there were different views and disagreements about what would constitute an effective liberation. The conservative and extremist part of the exile communities claimed that only a complete eradication of communism would assure this. The majority, however, said that many of the economic and social changes introduced under the communists would have to stay because they had become part of each nation's life. But they demanded free elections, obviously. And some émigré politicians even began to argue that liberation might well come from a gradual democratization of the communist regimes. Hopes for the liberation, with the risk of an armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, ran highest during the 1952 American presidential campaign, or presidential election between Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson, when there was much talk about the forced liberation. The votes from American Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, etc. sent the Republican candidate to the White House because they expected that Ike would take a tough stance against the Soviet. However, on the other hand, we should not forget to mention another issue, that the Congress investigations during the McCarthy years. Some of the exile politicians had to defend themselves at the hearings of special House or Senate committees led by Republican Congressman Charles Scranton from Wisconsin or Senator William E. Jenner from Indiana. And in few cases, these people were also accused of being communist collaborators or Soviet spies, so they rather moved back to England or to France to avoid further persecution. After Stalin's death in March 1953, it seemed that opportunities for change in particular countries of the socialist bloc would open up. The first attempts were seen in the German Democratic Republic, where in June 1953 there were serious social protests which involved about 400,000 people in over 250 cities across the country, including East Berlin. These protests were pacified very quickly as a result of a Soviet military intervention. So this was the first serious blow to the hopes and naive expectations of the émigrés. The other one was the Geneva summit of July 1955, where the representatives of the United States, Soviet Union, France and Britain met for the first time in a decade following the end of the war. Before the summit conference, the Western leaders were swamped with telegrams and resolutions from various exile organizations demanding that the problem of the liberation be put on the agenda. Although President Eisenhower seemed open to the suggestion, the issue of liberation was not raised in Geneva. Moreover, the summit was followed by a period of disappointments because communist Albania, Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania were admitted to the United Nations, and the failure of the West to intervene effectively in the Polish and Hungarian uprisings in 1956 raised the question whether there was room for political exiles and their activities in a world where conflicting systems tolerated one another. The Cold War and communist supremacy over Eastern Europe lasted, as you know, for decades, and the majority of the let's say fighters for freedom and democracy didn't live to see the fall of the Iron Curtain in the fall of 1989. Therefore, we historians need to catalog their efforts and make sure that their work will not be forgotten. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, that is the perfect image to end the talk on. Thank you so much, Mark.
Welcome.
All right, so now we will have the Q&A. So if you're interested, just to ask our speaker any type of question you'd like, raise your hand. I'll come over and hand the mic over to you. Just say who you are and what your question is. So who wants to start us off?
My question was, with the groups in the foreign countries, America for instance, was there communication between dissidents still remaining in the countries and the groups in the foreign countries? And if so, how was there communication between them?
Yes, there were some channels how to pass the news from behind the Iron Curtain to the West, but the networks of collaborators of the exile communities was quickly decreased because of the pressure of the state securities and of the police measures. For example, in the case of Albania, the counterintelligence services of the United States and of Great Britain planned a coup, to be held by let's say special units or by partisans from Albanian mountains, but because of the lack of background and because of lack of information how this could be done, it completely failed, and thousands or hundreds of people were arrested by Hoxha's regime, and that completely ruined the plans for liberation of Albania. So this was the extreme case that the networks were completely destroyed in Albania, but in late 1950s almost no one remained as a good source of information behind Iron Curtain, unfortunately. And then in 1960s, it turned back during the liberation of the regime in Czechoslovakia, for example, that new channels were found how to smuggle, the information materials back to Czechoslovakia. But it's another story. I'm focused primarily on the first decade of the Cold War, between 1946 and 56, until the Hungarian uprising, because I think this was the most important turning point, after which the emigres simply understood that the West wouldn't intervene to help them and to liberate their countries. So that's why most of the exile organizations I showed you simply stopped to exist after 1956. The most important period of their activities was really early 50s.
How severe was the suppression of dissent by state security in Czechoslovakia in particular?
You mean? Could you repeat the question again?
The state security
Yes.
in Czechoslovakia during the post-1948
Yep.
period, and
Yeah.
how severe was the suppression of dissent by the state security apparatus
You mean at home in Czechoslovakia?
in Czechoslovakia?
Oh, I see.
in particular?
The political system after World War II was, agreed or proven by the Soviets that the coalition government would be formed by 6 or 7 political parties, and all of them were formed into harmless satellites of the Communist Party after 1948. But the people, the electorate, and also the former officials of these original parties were still active. So the state security focused on these people. They wanted to expel them from the public life. They even wanted to put so high pressure that these people decided to leave. And the state security was also very active in the displaced person camps. They had a lot of agents, a lot of who provoked, the strifes between the sympathizers of political parties, and also between the Czechs and the Slovaks. So state security, I would say, or its activities were more important abroad in the displaced person camps, because they try to undermine the nascent exile activities, from the very beginning. As I said, in the camps, the first periodicals were published, and these people tried to put the Czechs and the Slovaks against each other, and it was a very important thing.
Well, hopefully this isn't breaking the rules, but actually I have a question for you. In some of my own research, both for my previous book and the next one, I know the American government considered this program, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. of Massachusetts was a big supporter of it, of giving military training to Poles, Czechs, Hungarian young men in exile, with the idea of maybe an auxiliary force if it came to a war. Things like, it was a very controversial idea, but do the exile committees have any opinion on that, supporting it, not? Have you come across any of that?
Yeah, and it was a very popular topic for the communist propaganda at home, because as you know, there was a war in Indochina at the time, and many of young Czech refugees were recruited in the refugee camps, because when you're staying in a camp for months and even years, then you're lucky to get out from there. So the recruiters of the French Foreign Legion were active in the camps, and hundreds of young Czechs and Slovaks were sent to Indochina. Many of them died, but many of them were arrested and sent to communist Czechoslovakia, to serve as a warning point that don't go to the exile and don't try to fight against the communists, because you will lose. So yeah, it was a very serious thing. And one of my colleagues recently published a book about this. Yeah, there were some Czechs fighting in Korea as well, and in Palestine, and yeah, many other places.
Yeah, that's remarkable, just because I know the French Foreign Legion recruited a lot of former German soldiers
Yeah.
as well. I can't imagine the interactions between them and some of the Czechs and Slovaks fighting in Vietnam, of all places, under French officers.
You know, it's the same like when the Czechs and Slovaks arrived to the refugee camps in 1948, guess who was waiting for them? The Sudeten Germans, you know, the expelled Germans who stayed in the camps for 3 years already, and now they had to share the barracks, you know. So you can imagine that the atmosphere wasn't very friendly.
Anyone else?
Can you talk about the status of the Russian influence in the Czech and Slovak Republic since 1989? Do they try to infiltrate, you know, or influence their politics and?
I would say yes in recent years, because our first president, Václav Havel, was a pro-Western. He brought us to NATO and to the European Union, but he passed away, it's 7 years ago already. And our current president, Zeman, who was re-elected just 3 months ago, well, you know, he says that he's not pro-Russian and not pro-Chinese, he's just pro-Czech, and that he understands that such a small nation in the Central Europe needs to maintain friendly relations to everyone, to the Americans and to Russians as well. But the Russians still think that the Czech Republic, or Czechia now, because we can officially call it Czechia finally, because the Slovak Republic is Slovakia. So now we are not, you know, Czech Republic, reminding some banana republic in Central America, but we are Czechia. So Russians still think that Czechia is the area of their influence, and they have a lot of property in Prague or in Karlovy Vary, the famous spa in Western Bohemia. And it became pretty recently, it was such an affair with Andrei Nikulin. I don't know if you're aware of this name. This is the Russian hacker who hacked Facebook, I guess, and Uber and other, you know, internet companies, and he was caught by Czech police in Prague last year, and it was a long month-lasting fight between the American and Russian Justice Department if he should be sent to Russia or to the US. And last week, our Minister of Justice decided to send him to Washington, which caused a, you know, sorry for this word, shitstorm from Moscow. So we'll see how it goes, but yeah, Russians still think that they are in charge of the Czech Republic, and I think that it's even worse in Slovakia because they're closer, right, and smaller.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone wants to close us out. Okay, well, then let's all give our guest speaker one final round of applause.
Thank you very much. I wrote a lot of articles in English about the exile, so then Professor Brennan could pass my email and I can send it to you who are interested. Thank you.
And